And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Robert Kapp. As I mentioned last week, Dr. Kapp, Bob as we like to call him, is one of my predecessors at the Washington Council on International Trade, where he was instrumental in bringing the 1993 APEC Summit to Seattle. I can't help but mention that Bob's great work there inspired us to think, well, maybe we could do the WTO. It seemed like a good idea at the time. In the early 90s, Bob was lured to Washington, D.C. for a 10-year stint as president of the U.S.-China Business Council. I'd say a highly successful 10-year stint. He returned to the region in 2004 to set up shop in Port Townsend as president of Robert A. Kapp and Associates. I haven't yet to meet any of his associates, but I'm sure that they're really good people. Serving corporate and NGO clients as they pursue their interests and solve problems in China and in Washington, D.C. He was recently named a senior advisor to Seattle's own Preston Gates and Ellis, now since the recent merger known as K&L Gates LLP, a global firm with significant presence in Seattle, Greater China, Washington, D.C., London, and other key locations. Bob has focused on China since the mid-'60s. We got to know him during 20 productive years here in Seattle. After teaching at the University of Washington, he became the founding executive director of the Washington State China Relations Council, an organization that thrives to this day. He's here today to share his insights, the insights gained through long experience and continuing engagement with China that deepens with every friendship and every visit. Fellow Rotarians, please welcome Dr. Robert Kapp.
It's great to be here. I have never spoken before the Seattle Rotary before. It's an honor that eluded me over my years of happy work in Seattle, and I'm delighted to be able to be with you today now that I'm back in the region and to see so many old friends, including Ian. Congratulations on your elevation, Adrian, but also my successor, Bill Center, my successor, Joe Borich, and who knows if there are any unknown children in the house that are... I'm happy to acknowledge you on some other occasion. We have a tough timekeeper, and I'm going to, I've seen him, I've seen his cards, his minutes cards, so I'm going to try to keep ahead of him. But the topic that Dave Elliott, and thank you, David, for including me in the program activities of Seattle Rotary. The topic that Dave Endicott asked me to talk about today was China and the environment. And since it's not something that I've spent all of my time on, I did a fair amount of reading and thinking leading up to this talk. So I'm going to move quickly through just a few comments about how well China is doing, and then turn to the meat of my discussion, which is that China's got very serious environmental problems, and try to share with you some thoughts on what those problems, what the implications of those problems are for us, before we open it up for Q&A, which I understand historically is the best part of any Rotary meeting. I'm sure this will be no exception. So just very quickly, no Seattle audience needs to be reminded of the success story that China so clearly is on so many fronts. The economy grows at 10% a year, 9 or 10% a year. The cityscapes, whether you've been there or not only in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou, but even into the major cities of the interior, are dazzling, and the rapidity of change and modernization in China's cities is spectacular to even the most casual observer. 400 million people have been raised from absolute poverty, which means living on less than $1 a day, to a level at least out of absolute poverty, even if not into wealth. 400 million in the past 20 years. The economy doubles every 10 years or so in size and will double again by 2010. From being an insignificant international trading nation back at the beginning of all of this, at the end of the 70s, China is now, as we all know, one of the great trading nations of the world. It is a huge magnet for foreign investment, often ranking first in terms of the amount of foreign investment coming into China on a worldwide basis year after year. The lifespan of the Chinese population, which was at 35 when China went through its revolution in 1949, now stands at 71. Infant mortality, which was at 200 per 1,000 live births in 1949, is now at 31 per 1,000. Infectious diseases now account for 0.0004% of the population, and that is, of course, a contrast to the epidemic years that those of us who are old enough to remember them, or our parents, remember China to have experienced for so long. China's manufacturer to the world. We don't need to discuss that further here. But it's also a huge importer. For all the difficulty of getting into China, China is a massive importer. It is a major, major market for U.S. imports, by far the fastest growing market for our exports to China, running 20 to 30% increases per year. China is developing political clout in the world, not from the force of its revolutionary ideology or its armed forces, but by its economic power and by its essentially, I hate to use the term charm offensive, but its efforts to cultivate favorable and civil, respectful relations with countries in all continents, very much including Africa and elsewhere in the developing world. It has no outstanding military confrontations internationally. China is, by and large, a supporter of the world systems as we know them. It's in the WTO, as you know well. It is not a system disruptor there. It's not a system disruptor at the UN. It's not a system disruptor in the international lending agencies like the World Bank and so forth. China is a world citizen, doesn't always see eye to eye with the United States, that goes without saying, but it is very much an active and involved and sophisticated participant in the structures of international affairs with which the United States is so heavily committed. And China has made a huge impression on the world, and will make an even bigger one in the sort of PR sense. The Olympics in Beijing in 2008 are a national obsession in China now, and you will be hearing about them endlessly for the next year and a half. And the World Expo in 2010 promises to be more of the same, and those are two little examples. So that's all on the good side. There's no need to discuss it further. When you think about where China was when I first went in January of 1977, for example, and where many of you went for the first time as long as 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, if not longer, Joe Boric, a classic example, it's just impossible not to marvel at really an unprecedented historical achievement that the Chinese people have accomplished. At the same time, all of this growth and development has brought downsides, which the world and the Chinese leadership are increasingly aware of. And the three big ones are economic disparities, the disparity of wealth, the inequalities of wealth distribution in China now are approaching levels associated with Latin America. That's one way to put it. And for a country that began in 1949 under communist leadership with an egalitarian insistence, the abandonment of the strict egalitarianism that we saw at its most fantastic or fanatical, you might say, during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s, the abandonment of that egalitarianism has brought enormous economic growth, but it has also brought huge inequalities, both between the urban and the rural sector, between the interior parts of China and the wealthy coastal zones, and among different segments of the population. So economic disparities are the first big one. The second one related to that are social stresses. This is a country undergoing enormous social tensions now. Nothing has crippled the society or the government, but the government admits to or announces 87,000 registered social incidents in the year 2005. 87,000 comes down to a couple of hundred a week, if I'm not mistaken, or is it a couple of hundred a day? I forget. I did the math once. But the point is, you could say, well, for a country in which some sort of social disturbances are taking place at the level of a few hundred a week, must be more than a week if there are 87,000 in a year, they're doing pretty well. If we had 300 disturbances a day breaking out around the United States, the country would be in meltdown, and China grinds along anyway. But whether you look at it with the glass half full or half empty, there are great social stresses in the place now, particularly relating to the abuses of privilege and the exercising of privilege often associated with official office to the disadvantage of those with less power. For example, in the seizing of people's land for the building of development projects without compensating people for their land or the land that they live on. And the third of the three, the big one that I want to spend a few minutes on, is a growing environmental crisis, which is very, very significant and very serious. So I'm glad you don't have your pencils out now, because this is going to be faster than you could ever write them down. But I'm going to throw at you a lot of examples of what's going wrong environmentally in China. Depending on whom you read, 7 out of 10 or 16 out of 20 of the worst air pollution cities in the world are in China. The problem is coal. 70% of the energy created in China is from coal, which is the most abundant resource for energy production inside the country, but increasingly from autos. China has 20 million cars on the road today. How many of you have been in Beijing in the last year? Oh, look at that. A lot of you have. Have you been on the third ring road at about 4 in the afternoon? It's an experience. It's really something. Well, 20 million cars now. The estimates are 110 to 150 million cars on the road by the year 2020. A new power plant goes online every week somewhere in China. Coal consumption is expected to double between 2000 and 2020. 5% of coal power plants have desulfurization equipment. 5% of the plants have adequate desulfurization equipment on their stacks. SO2 emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions, up 27% between 2000 and 2005. The government's announced goal was a 10% reduction. They went up 20% instead. China will overtake the United States as the #1 SO2 emitter by 2009, 10 years above the earlier authoritative predictions on when China would achieve that regrettable distinction. China is beset by low energy, a result in part of the legacy of Soviet-built factories, but also a legacy of other aspects of the way their system is structured. It takes vastly more energy to create a unit of a dollar's worth of production in China than it does even in India, but particularly in the United States and above all in Japan, which is very, very energy efficient. So low energy efficiency is a very, very serious matter. Acid rain affects 1/3 of the land mass of China. Rain in all the cities in Zhejiang province, where Hangzhou is located, but it's still a great place, I'm serious. But in all the cities in Zhejiang that were checked, acid rain was found in every single one. Regional haze is estimated to account for a 5 to 30% reduction in crop productivity across the country. Regional haze caused by a combination of things. In some parts of the country, dust, although we'll get to dust in a minute, but also in other parts of the country from man-made sources going into the air. 78% of the river water flowing through the cities of China is highly polluted. Major lake systems. There are several big lakes in China into which rivers flow and from which rivers flow out. Major lake systems are badly degraded. The Songhua River up on the Manchurian border with Russia in 2005 had a particularly serious incident when a chemical plant blew up and dumped tons and tons of benzene into the water, and everybody had to drink bottled water for 2 weeks until the water of the river was declared safe again. In the aftermath of that benzene case, which was a big deal, I mean, it shut off the water supply to a city of 1.5 million people for 2 weeks. In the aftermath of that explosion, the State Environmental Protection Agency announced that there were 130 water pollution incidents in the 11 months following the Songhua River event. Water overuse is another matter. The Yellow River, which many of you are familiar with, the great waterway of northern China, now runs dry and doesn't make it all the way to the Pacific Ocean in most years. There's just no water left because of upstream usages and diversions. The North China water table around Beijing and in the North China Plain is dropping at the rate of 1 meter a year. That is the subsurface water table going down 1 meter a year. Water demand is expected to triple between 1995 and 2030. 870 million tons of solid waste went into the environment in 2001, 870 million tons. By 2004, that was at 1,200 million tons of solid waste. Farmland, 22% of the population of the world is in China and is fed by approximately 7, some people say 10%, of the cultivatable land of the world. 22% of the people live on between 7 and 10% of the world's arable land. 10 million hectares, or 1/10 of the total arable land in China, is now estimated to be polluted. 12 million tons of crops are polluted by heavy metals every year. Deforestation causes erosion and silting of rivers, which is one of the problems with the Yellow River. 400 million people are affected by desertification. Are you depressed yet? I'm almost done with this. 400 million people are affected by desertification. That means land which had been growing green plants, and in many cases crops, surrenders to the encroaching desert, and the sands take over and nothing grows, and the people must move elsewhere. They lose about 1,300 square miles a year to desertification. We could go on about biodiversity. We could go on about marine pollution. The World Bank ranks China 133rd out of 146 countries on environmental sustainability. The World Health Organization estimates that 20% of the rural population, which again in China, 65–70% of the Chinese people are still in rural China. They're not in shiny Shanghai where you and I go. They're out in the countryside. 27% of the rural population has no access to safe water. Sanitation coverage extends to only 51% of the Chinese population. The State Environmental Protection Agency of China estimates that environmental damage accounts for between 1/3 and 2/3 of the growth of the GDP every year, or at least they estimated that in 2004. So when we say, boy, this place is going like gangbusters, they're growing 10% a year. The flip side of that is that environmental pollution is being estimated to cost the economy somewhere between 3 and 10% of GNP every year. Or, as some people would say, it comes out to about half of the growth that's taking place in the economy is compromised by environmental damage. So you can see it's a really serious matter. It has imposed itself on China and the world in ways that really, for the most part, with some exceptions, the United States has not yet known and hopefully never will know. I might say it has an international dimension to it. There is, on the one hand, the marine pollution that is coming from the rivers as they open out into the China Sea, the Yangtze, the classic case, where all of the wastes which are flowing down the river finally wind up, or not all of them, but a portion of them wind up flowing out into the marine environment surrounding the Chinese coast. But the other aspect of it, which has been noted in Seattle and in the Northwest and on the west coast of the United States, is that the so-called Asian brown cloud, which is created by particularly from sources in China, again, a combination of dust from the desert and pollutants being put into the atmosphere from power plants and industrial plants. That Asian brown cloud moves into the jet stream and makes its way across the Pacific and has certainly been picked up and detected in the western United States. Now, the government of China, to its credit, has finally really come to grapple with this in a very sort of first priority way. And starting last year, the regime said, look, we've just got to go about development in a different way. We still need economic development. We've got 30 million people a year entering the workforce who need jobs. We've got hundreds of millions of people who are very poor. But we cannot continue to go on saying growth is everything and not pay attention to the consequences of that growth. And the regime at the top in Beijing, from the president, the prime minister, and the environmental agency and so forth, they have put out a series of broad, overarching calls for the redirection of China's priorities. And they put some muscle into that. You can do things with tax policies. You can do things to encourage or discourage certain kinds of industries from operating in certain ways. You can penalize people and try to enforce what are now pretty good environmental laws. You can penalize people for violating those laws, or at least you should be able to. And the central government is committed rhetorically to enforcing laws and, in fact, shutting down hundreds and thousands of illicit or unauthorized mills, whether they be tanning mills or paper mills or cement plants or other factories that are violating the environmental laws that the regime has not put on the books. So they're there on that. There are specific targets. The Chinese still have something of a planned economy. It's not planned like the old Russian days, like the old Soviet days, but it's a planned economy where the government lays out targets for the society, and those targets now include environmental targets. 20% energy intensity reduction of 20% by 2010. 70% wastewater treatment by 2010, 60% residential garbage treatment by 2010. These, in a country of 1.5 billion people, these are not small matters after all. We're talking huge mobilizations of manpower and huge problems of logistics and enforcement, but at least the government has said, we can't wait any longer on this. We've got to have sustainable development. Our society will tear itself apart if we continue to grow without concern for these side effects. And the problem for the government is getting people to understand that the side effects of their own economic activities come back to hurt them themselves. I mean, one survey of factory owners in China found that 18% of the entire range of factory owners surveyed concluded that environmental controls were good for them. And the other 82% either thought they had no significance at all or were bad for them. Well, there's a huge task of persuasion and compulsion involved in getting a society on this roller coaster of economic growth to start rethinking the nature of its priorities. There's heavy engagement with the international community. Most of the major NGOs working on the environment are in China. Some of them have successful programs there. Things that seem like a drop in the bucket still have to be done. But that engagement is ambiguous because the government remains very uneasy about foreign interference in China's domestic affairs and very uneasy about NGOs not under the control of the government beginning to advocate positions or to urge the population to take positions that might not agree with government policy overall in this still very controlled political system. So the government recognizes that there are huge challenges ahead. For the international community, it does matter to us. It matters to all of us. The global commons, you don't need to be preached to about this, and I'm not the one to do the preaching anyway, but the global commons includes the air we all breathe and includes the seas we all live on and try to live with. And so the question is, what does the international community, and especially the U.S., think and do when it looks at this huge environmental crisis in China, which is not, despite some of the optimistic propaganda, is not really fundamentally turning for the better yet, and in fact, in some ways, is continuing to get worse. Well, the first thing that let's just talk about America, since you and I both know America better than we know the other countries that make up the world around us. The first thing we need to do when we talk about China's environmental crisis is recognize that we have to ask compared to what. I mean, this is a country which you have to give China credit for all that it has done in so many sectors, even as we find that their environmental record is in such disarray and in such need of improvement. I tried to speak to that at the beginning when I talked about China's achievements. It's important to recognize when we think about China on this or other things which are troubling, we've got to be realistic about ourselves as well. China may overtake the United States as the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases in the next 10 years, but we are the #1 emitter of greenhouse gases and have been for as far back as you can imagine. Moreover, China's still got, and this is a real problem, China's still got 4 times the population we do. So on a per capita basis, even if China overtakes the United States as the world's greatest emitter of greenhouse gases, on a per capita basis, you have to say that just because China has so many people, the worst you could say, in a sense you could say the worst is still to come, or else you have to say, my heavens, if we ever get to the point where on a per capita basis China matches the United States in its degradation of the global environment, we have a problem of just unlimited magnitude. There are people in the United States who look at China and see in China a threat of one kind or another to the United States in the future, and I don't have to rehearse that with you. A lot of it is economic, as you know. It relates to employment, it relates to manufacturing, to the manufacturing sector. In some cases, people are worried about military concerns. But there is also a concern, there can become a concern that China represents this kind of global threat to the existence of life on Earth as we know it, you might say. That is, if you read the most panicky or the most apocalyptic articles, you get a feeling that China becomes viewed as this kind of insatiable kind of torrent spewing out into the world, gobbling up the world's resources, destroying the tropical rainforests, and at the same time polluting the world with its effluents. And I think we have to be very cautious about getting into that state of mind. For one thing, China is not alone. China is the first of the great underdeveloped countries to set itself on the path to economic development in terms of rising per capita incomes. But India is not far behind. We are not looking at just China here. This is not those bad guys in China doing these terrible things. We're talking about a fundamental change in the history of really life on Earth, but certainly of human life on Earth, because of the ability now, the transferability of knowledge of science, of technology, of finance, of a lot of things, the ability of underdeveloped countries to finally get their acts together and become lower or middle or even upper middle to join the ranks of the less impoverished or even the middle-class nations of the world. So China is not the only country to think about when we start getting worried about what China's development is going to do to us. Now, Lester Brown is not somebody everybody agrees with. He's a very controversial guy, but he writes some interesting things. And I know I'm going to be running out of time. I haven't looked at Larry yet, but I'm sure I'm short of time, so I'm going to just close with a quote by him and then open this to Q&A. Lester Brown is with an outfit called the Earth Policy Institute, and years ago he asked the question, who will feed China? He says, the point is that the Western economic model is not going to work for China. All they're doing is what we've already done. So you can't criticize them for that. But what you can say is it's not going to work. And if it isn't going to work for China, then by 2031 it won't work for India, which by then will have an even larger population, nor for the other 3 billion people in the developing countries. And in some way, it will not work for the industrialized countries either, because in the integrated global economy, we all depend on the same oil and the same grain. The bottom line is that we're going to have to develop a new economic model. Instead of a fossil fuel-based, automobile-centered, throwaway economy, we will have to have a renewable energy-based, diversified transport system and comprehensive reuse and recycle economies. If we want civilization to survive, we will have to have that. Otherwise, civilization will collapse. Now, this is not, the kind of thing you ring the Rotary bell about, but I guess what I'm saying is there really are significant issues raised by China's rapid economic growth and the environmental destruction which is accompanying that. Those issues will play out in China more and more as people who are affected by those environmental catastrophes decide they're not going to take it any longer. And there have been many, many small incidents of that already where cadmium poisoning of a river meant that the people who lived on the river's water could no longer survive from their usual pursuits and so forth and so on. The social tensions in China engendered by this environmental crisis are going to grow in intensity. But at the same time, the world has a role to play. The United States, in my view, should place environmental cooperation with China at the top of the American agenda. It's there. There are programs going on. It's nowhere near enough. We get so preoccupied with anti-dumping cases and so preoccupied with military preparations and so preoccupied with even with human rights cases in a way, although some of those human rights cases involve environmental activists who have been mistreated by the government for making too much noise, that we, in a sense, we certainly haven't put, and neither have the Chinese, environmental issues at the top of the U.S.-China agenda. They should be there. The United States has various programs for environmental cooperation with other countries which are compromised or limited in their application to China because of existing rules that prohibit us from running those programs with China for reasons going back to political matters between the two countries and to China's track records in other sectors. Those programs should be fully activated with China, and all of us need to be doing everything we can, not only to prevent China's problems from spilling into the United States, but also to get to the point where if we're all in the same boat, we all get the boat safely to a more promising shore than we now see in the environmental issues that are coming up to engulf China. Thank you.
That was great, Bob. I think you gave me something to ring the Rotary bell about, which brings us to this week's pretty good rule. Be loyal. Keep other people's secrets and don't burden them with yours. See you next week.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from Enterprise Seattle. For over 35 years, Enterprise Seattle has provided client-based economic development services to businesses throughout King County and its 39 cities. More information on Enterprise Seattle and how they help businesses grow and prosper can be found at www.enterpriseseattle.org. And by First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.